regarding the CDC property, and I see there's lots of faces out here. Thank you for coming. We are going to proceed and have some conversations with the CDC folks as well as Mr. Francia. This is not a public meeting or public hearing, so we're going to try to keep our comments and conversations focused to those two folks. In fact, I don't really even see, yes I do. There's a CDC person here and Mr. DeFrancia. Is there anybody on staff that would like to make some opening remarks?
No, I mean, this is actually one of our last pre-application discussions that we have, and so today we have James DeFrancia from World Enterprises, and come on up to the table, and Jim is going to walk us through his proposal and his current thinking, and we're going to follow that with some remarks if the CDC wants to make any remarks, and then any council comments, and then we don't have a setup for public comment. The other person that we have kind of in play is we have Bruce Kimmel. He's just on the phone. He's not going to make any presentation, but he's here if the council has comments, questions that they would like to ask him, because a lot of this is the kind of financial proposal that we're putting on the table. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over.
Yeah. Davis?
Yeah. I was going to suggest that Tom could offer his input for the council about this pre-application process, which this will be, like it was mentioned before, this is second to the last one we're going to do, and then in the future these will go to staff, and we just don't want to get into sideways with the quasi-judicial process. So,
Yeah, for the record, it should be clear that this is an informal discussion. It's exploratory. Nothing said here is binding on the applicant or on the town or on the town council members. There is no pending land use application. There may be one in the future, and the council has to keep an open mind about any application that is submitted at that time, and be prepared to consider comments pro and con on any such application. So it's important to understand that the comments that are made are in that context.
Okay, thanks. Susan, did you have anything else?
I don't know this.
no,
All right,
I
thanks,
already
guys. Mr. DeFrancia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I'm delighted to be here. Just a brief history, particularly for some of the new members of the council. We engaged in this process about 2.5 years ago when we first started. We came forward at that time after the Downtown Area Advisory Committee had come up with some concepts. We put out a plan that called for a substantial amount of development in terms of gross square footage and size. It's about 100 square feet, but it also did call for about an acre of the property being dedicated to a park and our construction of an amphitheater in that park. We were going to provide some other amenities as well. That proved not commensurate with the town's desires, so we stepped back and reflected on some other options. But then the matter came forward in the context of the town purchasing the entire site, and that, as you well know, came to a vote last November and was defeated. And so we had been just sitting on the sidelines during that time frame, waiting to see what was going to unfold. In January, after things had kind of settled down, I re-engaged with Susan and the town staff to see what we might do to kind of reactivate options for the property, and gave some thought to a lot of things we learned just from following public discussion in the press, meetings and discussions held among the council, and our conversations with the staff. Came away with the understanding that perhaps about 55,000 square feet would be an acceptable level of development. And then there was some discussion over the last many months about the polygon and some form of public use for that polygon site. We explored different kinds of options for that internally and with our planners. And then we engaged, a few months ago, we started engaging with the art base. And the art base we knew was looking for a new venue. We talked to them about what their needs were, what kind of a facility they might require. And that struck us as in essence, a public amenity, if you will, a nonprofit that puts a lot of focus on the arts community for the benefit of the town of Basalt and the public. and also it seemed to be an appropriate use for this particular site. That caused us to then generate a concept plan, which is what I submitted a couple of weeks ago to Susan, with some thoughts about how that kind of a program might go forward. I underscore and accept Tom's admonition, nothing binding about any of these conversations on the part of either party. We fully understand that and accept that. I put this forward, in essence, as a means of, I think, re-engaging and reinitiating a dialogue and a conversation to see if there's some form of acceptable development that is commensurate with the desires of the town, economically viable from our standpoint, and ultimately and necessarily acceptable to CDC, who remain the landowners and who have their own necessary financial goals that they wish to achieve in terms of the ultimate disposition of that property. And that's one of the things that plays into what we proposed, which is it speaks to our making a very significant several million-dollar commitment to Art Base to deliver effectively a completed facility on top of land that we would purchase and then donate. But in combination with that and the reduced amount of development compared to where we started, it didn't leave anything left over for us to reimburse the town for the expenditures that it incurred several years ago cleaning up the Pan and Fork and the old trailer park, or for that matter, any consequential amount that we could devote to things like public housing. So the concept as presented was, here's a form of development that demonstrates an economic viability, allows some considerable expenditure of funds for what we perceived as public benefit, albeit going to the Art Base, and thought that would be a good point of departure to open up discussions. We're looking for guidance, we're looking for feedback, we're looking to see what works for the town and is acceptable to the public interest, and then we can refine these numbers and adjust them as needed. And of course, at some point, we need to engage with CDC, because obviously we started out this process 2.5 years ago willing to pay them $3 million, which is what they were seeking to recover, but that was for effectively 3 times the amount. We're only looking about understand. It's an opening proposal. You know, it's not meant to be necessarily committed on the part of either party, but thought it would engage in the dialogue. It's kind of like saying, you want to go to dinner, and then the other party says yes. And then you start talking about what day, what time, what restaurant, and who's going to pay. So we've sort of opened the dialogue in that context, and that's what we're seeking to derive from the town.
And there's a representative from CDC here that maybe wants to make some comments.
Michael?
I'm Michael McVoy. I'm board president of the CDC and have been for the last 6.5+ years that we've been involved in this project at this point.
50, right?
It feels like it's been a long one, and I have to say, you know, as a nonprofit, which we are and which we have from the beginning been motivated to try and accomplish. First of all, our primary mission was the social justice to the residents of the trailer park and in the moving of the trailer park residents. And as I've previously said, I think that was a major success. The town certainly was a major factor in making that happen. We contributed in our own way on a private level to help facilitate that. Our project has been very successful. We are now at a point where, as the landowner, our goal is to recover our investment, to pay back our lenders, and to regenerate the funds that will go back into the nonprofit for the work we do. The other thing safe to say is The vision, moving of the trailers and relocation of residents, I think that had some clarity around it. I think it's fair to say that since the property's been cleared, the perception of Basalt and the realization of the opportunity that that land presents has really opened up, and there have been no lack of opinions as to what should or shouldn't happen with that property. But as Jim mentioned, when we really got involved back in the end of 2010, when we first put the property on tract, we had done a lot of research into the master plan that was in place at the time, and there had been a long-term expectation, looking at the planning documents that were in place at that time, that the property would be fully developed and would be developed more along the lines of the project across the street, Gold Court. All of that was kind of an anticipation. It quickly became apparent that that level of density, there were a lot of concerns about the river not being able to be seen, and what that size of development would do to downtown. And I think it's somewhat gotten lost along the way that while the expectations have been reduced, the amount of development that is acceptable to the town has been reduced, the amount of public use spaces, both in terms of a park and the polygon and potential art base and other community-oriented uses, while that has all kind of come to the surface in the process that you all have engaged in with the community, it has also essentially put us in a position where the value of our land has probably been dropping, both because of the length of time it takes, which we have ongoing costs, but also because the value of the property is ultimately a factor of the amount of development that's approved for that. And I know, going back, I don't know if Bruce is on the line, but I know Bruce Kimmel put out a report 3 or 4 years ago, probably before a number of you were on council, essentially outlining the balance between the amount of development you approve and the value of the property and ultimately the cost to the town. And I think it's safe to say that we are very engaged and interested in this process, and hopeful that in some form we can get a productive sense of what you actually believe will be possible for that property in terms of development, because from our point of view, it's directly correlated to the price that we're going to ultimately be able to get. And as you know, we've agreed to a price to sell it to the town several times in the last 6 months. I don't know, having read the paper, whether the $400,000 that was there then went away and apparently is now back relative to your finances or where things stand on all of that. But it's very helpful to have a sense of how the town is looking at the property going forward, and what you see as its future, that future.
From the council.
Madam Mayor, if I
Yes, sir.
may point out just one thing. We, as you're aware, we received a letter from Art Base in support of the concept. I would remind you,
purchase the whole thing. That's $3.5 million that, from our view, in looking to develop 55,000 square feet, we interpret as a cost, and then how we disperse that cost is where we're looking for guidance from the town. So following your logic, we could say, well, we can, the town, I can pay more to CDC. That reduces what the town might have to pay to get their remaining acre to add to the park. Or we could put it all to CDC, and then what's left over we can distribute elsewhere. Or we can say, we'll do less for the art base, maybe we just give them the land and an improved site, but we don't give them a building. Well, then I've got money that I can put into affordable housing, or contribute to the acquisition of the park, or things of that nature. So
I would be more in line with something like that.
So I see where you're coming from and how you could have come to that conclusion. I'm just explaining how we're approaching this from the
Understand.
This is more in line with my understanding up till now.
Right.
And I'd like to just mention, because it's been an opportunity or a possibility that's been on the table since predating the election, the assumption has always been that the town would be able to benefit from some open space funds or GOCO funds or other funds relative to the purchase of the park. And so when you look at that number, that's not a number that you necessarily need to be looking at as a top line number. It's a number before grants, before other abilities to offset some of those costs are factored into that equation. So
The 800,000 specifically.
well, or, 800,000 was a number that was floated before the election. I think that's actually a little bit flexible number, depends upon the size and the cost of the park. And so that's just an ongoing discussion that has to be factored in terms of, it's not the top line of that number, it's the net number that is going to be a number that would potentially be a factor for the town.
Anybody else have questions? Comments? Davis?
I think maybe I'll talk a little bit about art base, because Mr. Francia's proposal included kind of land under them and a building. And in exchange for that, there would be, the ask is for some considerable concessions from the town. I would point out that obviously those are decisions that ultimately the council would have to make, separate apart perhaps from a land use application. And so I think the range on that is perhaps in a land use application process, a parcel is created that potentially art base could pursue an option on and pursue financing, and just like pursue construction of a building. To the other end of the spectrum, which is what Mr. DeFrancia has put in his letter of concept before the council. So I think there's a range on that, and obviously art base, I think my read, from my perspective, is that that's a great location for art base. Good place for them to be. How they get there, I think that field is wide open.
Well, I'm ready to comment on land use and financing, now that I've heard the questions. On land use, I don't have much to say. If, as you say in your letter, the total size of the project, 75,000, is within the zoning or other code parameters that's allowable, then that is a land use process that gets initiated by you, and I'm perfectly open to going through the process, but I cannot give any opinion until the actual process is engaged in. And if Art Base wishes to be part of that process with a parcel of their own, I'm certainly willing to look at that as well. And that's really all I feel comfortable saying before we have an official application before us. On the financing, I have quite a few concerns. I would be very challenged to support the requests that have been made in the financial package. And here's some of my concerns. First of all, giving up discount on our building fees. Our building fees are the city income. That's what we pay the lights with. That's what we pay the staff with. Giving up our income means we have to borrow it from our general fund reserves. We just got through a process of an extreme austerity budget because we were giving away land to nonprofits and we were running budgets that were deficit budgets. I cannot support anything that puts the town back in that position. As far as giving up the affordable housing, I believe that goes against longstanding public sentiment, and it goes against the current code, which has been approved by the P&Z and prior councils. That affordable housing requirement has been reduced to where it is not the onerous thing that it used to be, roughly 25%. It's now down to 15%, and it fulfills our long-term goals to add small amounts of affordable housing within reason from a variety of different projects as they come on for development. I believe politically that would be extremely unpopular to do away with the affordable housing and would cause just a great deal of extra controversy that doesn't need to be here. So that's that. On the $2.5 million Art Base, I'm really quite surprised by it. This has not been in our process. This was never part of our town planning process. I feel like it's been thrown up at the last minute, and I really don't think we've had adequate time to digest it and consider. Here's some of my brief concerns, though. Number one, that's not what the original money was invested for. $2.5 million was invested to make that land available for development and park. And that was in the original bond language for the first $5 million that people voted on. There was always a desire through the process to see the possibility of profit locate somewhere on the pan. But there was never any commitment by the council to fund any amount for a capital project of a nonprofit. There was an openness to look at the land use planning to afford spaces for them. In my opinion, capital projects need to be the business of the nonprofit and work with their membership and outreach, raise because they are concessions. I could see be up to you. And say, we either get back 1.5 million, if it's financially more advantageous to the town, and that would be the return of the $2.5 million combined to the town. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernie. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Yes, Jen.
I'll just comment that I've made my comments very clear all along. Michael, since you're here in person, please consider bifurcation. And that's all along the same thing of everything that I've stated. Nothing's changed.
And by bifurcation, for clarity, you mean splitting the property? Is that what you're talking about?
If, without Lowe's involved at all, if there is an opportunity to purchase part,
Subdivision.
Yeah, basically subdivided, so the one part is left for us to acquire and the other part is left for the town to acquire or whoever to acquire, right?
whoever, however,
Yeah.
yeah.
And our position on that, just for the record, and I think we've said this before, but for purposes of clarity, we are completely open to whatever split. What we're not open to is essentially selling off one piece now and being dependent upon future approvals to determine the value of the rest. If we have an understanding as to what the value of the entire piece of property is, and it has value because it's in different pieces to, you know, park, public, development, whatever combination of those, we're completely open to whatever subdivision, land split, or anything else. We're just reluctant to enter into a process where we sell off one piece and have everything dependent upon our ability to recover our investments and pay back our lenders, dependent upon something that's an unknown. And so,
And you know what, that's great, because I will mirror from this seat the exact same comments back to you, that as well, it's uncomfortable to tie a development to the town acquiring a piece of property. And
Okay.
so, yeah.
we're completely, I mean, we'd split it into as many pieces as is appropriate to make a deal happen, that it's an acceptable deal to the town, to us, to a development project, to a nonprofit. We have no limits on how far we're willing to go to subdivide or otherwise apply whatever land use process necessary to accomplish the overall goal.
Anybody else? Well, I think a lot has been said, and it covers most of what I would say as well. I'm still consistently on the same page I've been for a couple years, where we all agreed, even the past council, that about half, 50% was going to be a park and 50% was going to be development. I would like to see exactly what Jen is talking about, a subdivision and separate sales. But I know that there are things hung up on that. I couldn't support public funding or taxing for parking or really anything else at this point. So I'd love to make it simple rather than more difficult, if that's possible. And that's kind of all I have. If that's
Okay.
all the council has, and do you have any closing remarks, either of you?
Go ahead, Mike.
I'll throw out a question, and this is a question that is actually a little bit tied up in some of the process. I think we have an understanding that when the CDC was working with the town to have the process of the first bond and all the river work done, I think we have clarity that the CDC hadn't agreed to pay any of that money back, that the money, any way of the town getting its money back was essentially a process of the development. And so that as the landowner, we can't afford to pay, have $3 million invested in the land and have $2.5 million to pay back the town. I would love, and I don't think this is the proper place right now, but I would love to come to a better understanding of how that number was evolved. For example, I know there's relocation costs of the residents. And as we have acknowledged at this point, one of the things that often wasn't included in any of that calculation was the $1 million that was privately financed, that never was involved in any of the public relocation expenses. But the reality is, the way that project of relocating those residents worked, without the private money that we raised and put on the table that provided homes to 12, 13, 14 of the families that were over there, the relocation wouldn't have succeeded anywhere near as well. And I think the other factor that remains an issue to me is, our property is still in the floodplain. As you may be aware, we just applied for a fence permit within the town process and been granted that permit, and that fence will be going up shortly. But as we look at where those expenses actually came from, less than, I don't have an exact number, but maybe 15 to 20% of the property was ever in the floodplain in the first place. And to have half of the entire project, which included everything from Old Pond Park up to the bridge, both sides of the river, and we were well set back from the river, and only 20% of the property was ever in the floodplain originally, and that would have been a factor. And that factor would have been fairly easy to, since there would have been an open space commitment, that might have been where the open space would have gone. I'd like to engage in that discussion and have a better understanding of how the town has decided that it invested $2.5 million that it needs back. I understand why it wants it back, and I've had many conversations, in particular with Mike Scanlon when he was here, but in the end, it kind of seemed like it was, okay, we'll give you guys 50% of that load and we'll take the other half. And so that's a discussion I think that would be helpful from our perspective to make sure that we understand what it is that you consider to have been money. One of the classic things that happens is that when a public money is used to increase the benefit of private property, that's an issue, and there's private inurement issues, and there's code and law around this. But I think it's very fair to say from the discussions that we've had, increase by anywhere near the amount of money that $2.5 million. And so I understand that the town wants to recover the money, and I think it can if it wants to improve a development that would do that. But I find that number to be confusing to me in terms of correlating it to the actual value agreements that were in place when that money was spent. So I have an understanding of that.
Michael, there is a spreadsheet that has floated around out there for like my whole life. With those numbers, we could start with that outside this process and sit down with Judy and Chris or who's in everybody, right, and look at those numbers again. Because it's been
and I think that spreadsheet was fairly broad. It wasn't very detailed, and it just took me a discussion, because we certainly understand that to the extent that that work improved the value of our property, that's a expectation that the town would have to recover money that goes to a private benefit. But since it's pretty clear that at this point we may not be getting any of that benefit in terms of the value of the property,